Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's Science, Technology, and Policy Forum lecture. As I'm sure most of you know, this series was started last fall as a way to spark dynamic campus-wide dialogue on scientific and technological innovations and discoveries and their potential societal and broader policy impacts. I want to take a moment, first of all, as we have our last lecture for this academic year, to thank you all for participating and for your enthusiastic response to this forum. Very much appreciate the campus community's involvement in this. It's been such a pleasure to host this series and to hear leading scientists, technologists, and policy experts discuss their fields and talk about the importance of science and technology as a critical public good. I can think of no better person to wrap up this year's lecture series than our today's speaker, Fay Lomax Cook. Fay is the head of Social Behavioral Economic Sciences Director at the National Science Foundation. It's an influential arm of the NSF that funds more than half of all the nation's university-based basic research in the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. SBE, as I'm sure many of you know, because many of you are principal investigators for SBE that are funded by SBE, its mission is to promote the understanding of human behavior and social institutions and ways that economic, environmental, political, and social forces that affect the lives of people from birth to old age, and the ways that people affect these forces. Fay is on leave from Northwestern University, where she is a faculty fellow of the Institute for Policy Research and a professor of human development and social policy. Fay's research focuses on the interrelationships between public opinion and social policy, the politics of public policy, public deliberation, energy policy, and the dynamic of public and elite support for social programs, particularly programs for older Americans, such as Social Security. She's the author of many articles and chapters, as well as 5 books, including her most recent book, Talking Together, Public Deliberation and Political Participation in America. This is a very timely and relevant book to the current public discourse on especially this year's election. I'm sure you agree. On a personal note, many of you know that I served at the National Science Foundation. I had the pleasure of overlapping with Fay at NSF for a bit of time, and I witnessed firsthand the fresh thinking that she brought to NSF during a particularly challenging time for government-funded basic research in many areas, including social science and economics. She's an insightful and thoughtful collaborator, and I'm really grateful that she's able to join us here, and I'm very happy to call her, of course, my friend. Before we hear from Fay, I just want to take a moment also to thank Dean Krishnan and also our colleagues here in Hines College for coordinating Fay's visit and serving as the college host for Fay. It is my pleasure to invite Fay Lomax Cook to the podium. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Fay.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely wonderful to be here at Carnegie Mellon University. We at the National Science Foundation feel a very special affinity toward Carnegie Mellon University. It's a wonderful university. It's one of the most interdisciplinary universities I know, but also we feel a special affinity because your president, Subra Suresh, was the director of the National Science Foundation for 3 years, and your provost, Farnham Jahanian, was head of SISE, Computer Information Science and Engineering, and because also we support you to the level of $280 million. So we have a lot invested in this university. And as somebody said to me, and it's not enough. And so I agree. I have been spending time talking today to a lot of faculty, and I was impressed before I came, but these faculty, they have been great conversations, and I've ended the conversations by asking them to tell me about grand challenges that they think are important for the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And I have to tell you that I have gotten some absolutely outstanding ideas, many ideas that I'd thought about, but some ideas that I hadn't, and so that was really exciting. So what I'm going to be talking about today is opportunities and challenges for the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. So the opportunities, of course, are the great research that we're able to support. So I want to begin by talking in general about the social, behavioral, and economic sciences in context, the importance to science and society, and I want to talk about SBE research priorities. But then I also want to talk about challenges to SBE research, and there I want to talk about two. One is the challenge of robust and reliable science, the problem and the challenge of reproducibility and replicability of the sciences. And second, I want to talk about the issue of communication and how we can do an even better job in communicating the great science that we do. So at the National Science Foundation, you really can't begin a talk about the context of the work we do without paying tribute to Vannevar Bush. And I think all across the United States, we in universities should pay tribute to him. He was the scientist and engineer, of course, who headed all the great science that took place during World War II. But when World War II ended, federal funding for science and engineering was going to end too. But Vannevar Bush had a vision, and he went to President Roosevelt and he said, "We've made great contributions during the war. We have to continue making great progress in peacetime." And so he wrote this amazing book, this report called Science, the Endless Frontier, because science, he sees, is a frontier. We stand on the shoulders of giants, we often say, but the frontier never ends because we make one discovery and then there's another and another. And in this book, he said, and it's up here, scientific progress is one essential key to our security as a nation, to our better health, to a higher standard of living, and to our cultural progress. And this is perfectly in line with what began as the National Science Foundation mission that has not changed, to promote the progress of science, and in so doing, the broader impacts to advance the national health, prosperity, and welfare, and to secure the national defense. So, at SBE, sometimes I'm asked, well, tell me about what is social, behavioral, and economic sciences research in a nutshell. Farnham actually said it, but here's my little heuristic model. SBE research has to do, at its core, with human behavior and social organization, and the way that economic forces, political forces, social and cultural forces, and environmental forces affect the lives of people from birth to old age, and how people can affect those forces. And what we also show is this little model. At NSF, my role as the head of the social, behavioral, and economic sciences is to help us invest in great research that can result in transformative science that advances knowledge, drives the U.S. economy, enhances national security, sustains global leadership, and improves lives. So how do we do that? Oh dear, I just went much too quickly. We don't do it that quickly. So this is what you see in front of you is our organizational model. Now, I'm not showing you this organizational model to talk about every little thing in it. I'm showing it to you to give you a sense of the huge diversity within the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. I actually think that we are one of the most diverse of the 7 directorates. We fund everything from archaeology and anthropology in the division of behavioral and cognitive sciences to the science and engineering indicators program in the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. So as you can see, SBE has 3 divisions: behavioral and cognitive science, social and economic science, and the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. Our core programs in the Behavioral and Cognitive Sciences Division address questions fundamental to human behavior and social organizations, what it means to be human, what are the origins of our human ancestors, where do stereotypes and biases come from, and how do we express them, how does vision work, what variables influence learning. Questions addressed by the core programs in our Social and Economic Sciences Directorate Division include questions like, what factors influence decision making? How, when, and why do we cooperate or compete? When does conflict arise? What variables impact economic markets? What aspects of an organizational structure impact its success? And then we are really proud to have the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is one of the major 13 statistical agencies. And NCSES, as we call it, is the center that conducts surveys to collect data on the science and engineering enterprise. So what we do at SBE, like in all of the directorates, is that we conduct basic research, and it's for the broader impact of creating knowledge that improves the future. So we sometimes get some criticism about the science that we support because we never know when we fund a particular study what impact it's actually going to have. And each of these little pictures here that you see, behind that picture is a story of some basic scientific research that we really didn't, we knew what the hypotheses were, but we didn't know what long-term impact it was going to have. And each of these pictures represents just one of many, many stories we could tell about this long-term impact. So I want to share with you just 3 little stories, short little stories about research that we funded that's made a big impact. And in each of these stories, it didn't happen overnight. We funded the research, and then we funded more research, and then we funded more research, and bam, there was an impact. And this is happening, I think, again and again. So one of the people that I was talking to today does research on game theory, and so he knows this well. The example from game theory began with Robert Wilson, as you can see in that circle up there, who applied game theory to the study of auctions, fundamental research on how people bid against each other. He began his work in the 1960s with support first from the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and later from Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate. Then Paul Milgram was Robert Wilson's graduate student in the 1970s, who was also working on auction theory. Later on, he began focusing on the unique and theoretical issues arising from simultaneous auctions of multiple items. His work was also supported by SBE. And here's where timing and policymaker interest played a key role in moving basic research to applications with real-world impact. Because Congress granted the Federal Communications Commission authority to conduct auctions to allocate portions of the radio wave spectrum, which transmits sound, data, and video across the country. In other words, the radio waves that allow us to talk on our cell phones and receive TV signals. And Wilson and Paul Milgram developed an auction process called a simultaneous multiple round auction. A similar idea was proposed by Preston McAfee. And the FCC asked the three of these economists to work together, and they designed the first auction. It was a huge success. And simultaneous multiple round auctions have been used for dozens of spectrum auctions in the United States and around the world. And these FCC auctions have raised over $120 billion for the federal government, and also helped the rest of us by providing access to cellular wireless networks. Now, it took a long time for this to happen. We were made a little bit of fun of in the beginning. What are you doing there in SBE, funding research on something called, game theory and auctions? But it's had a big impact. So let me give you another example. This example comes from a psychologist, Hilary Eifenbein, who received funding from the social psychology program at SBE. Her work focuses on emotion recognition, our ability to recognize another person's emotions via nonverbal cues such as facial expressions, vocal tones, and body language. Now, here's an example of a work, again, that we funded. We were criticized at the time we were funded this work from the Science Committee in the U.S. Congress and said, what are you doing funding research on nonverbal communication? But in fact, the Army Research Institute has realized that nonverbal communication is extremely important in situations when military personnel are in other parts of the world where they don't speak the language, yet they have to interact with local residents. And so now the Army Research Institute incorporates nonverbal communications training for our military personnel going overseas, all of them. So this work, and I won't go into the detail, has been extended to the business community, medicine, to education, the same research that has had effect and implications in at least 4 arenas. So here's the final example I'm going to tell you about. And this one, again, I was talking to one of your researchers today who does research in this area. This example has gone all the way to the White House, as you can see. In 1969, we funded the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, 2 psychologists who introduced prospect theory. It includes, as some of you well know, decision-making, and it helps explain why people sometimes make decisions that seem really irrational, at least from an economist's point of view. Prospect theory posits that gains and losses, rather than final amounts of wealth are what really sways our decision. It also posits that loss aversion, that the pain we feel from a gain of the same magnitude, that loss aversion is not so important as gains. And this work is a major building block of what we now call, of course, behavioral economics. Over the years, SBE's Decision Risk and Management Sciences program has sponsored research who have looked at how prospect theory plays out in different arenas and can be used in different policy areas. And in 1988, we funded Colin Cameron and his collaborators to study how people bought car insurance, of all things. Again, sounds strange, but in a hypothetical experiment, they found that people tend to choose whatever the default option is. If the high price option is the default, they'll pick that. If the cheaper policy is the option, they'll pick that. The point is that the way the choice was framed results in consumers' behavior. And these results, it was discovered, are really what happened in the real world. In the late 1990s, Richard Thaler and others, funded by the DRMS program, studied loss aversion that looked at people's decisions with savings accounts. They got around the loss aversion problem by having people commit to saving only what was going to be in tomorrow's, not today's, salary. And as a result, savings rates for these people over time tripled. Cameron, Thaler, and Cass Sunstein published a book called Nudge, which is a popular book which espouses a lot of this research. And the ideas espoused by these researchers have made it all the way to the White House, which now has a behavioral sciences team shown in this picture. And in the late fall, President Obama issued an executive order called Using Behavioral Science Insights to Better Serve the American Public. And it encourages executive branch agencies to develop strategies for applying behavioral science insights to federal programs to evaluate their impact, and to recruit behavioral experts and social scientists to join the federal government to make this happen. And they also, in this, have encouraged federal agencies to work more closely with the science community to better use empirical findings from the behavioral sciences. So these are just 3 examples from all those little pictures that I showed you to give you an example of just some of the research that we funded actually some years ago, but how it's had these long-term impacts. We also, in SBE, fund part of our core research infrastructure. We fund the big 3 that we call, you have heard about these, we've been funding these for years, the American National Election Studies, the General Social Survey, and the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And we also have a number of other data and survey investments that we fund as part of our research infrastructure. Do we need to do more? Yes. Do we need to think through some of the things that we're already doing? Yes. And those are some of our challenges for the future. And of course, I've already mentioned that our 3rd major division in SBE is the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, which is one of the nation's 13 principal statistical agencies and really the leading provider of statistical data and analyses for the U.S. science and engineering enterprise. They conduct every few years 17 periodic national surveys, and those are listed here. And 2 of the congressionally mandated reports that they put out every year are pictured here, the science and engineering indicators and the women and minorities and disability differences in our science and engineering workforce. So in a nutshell, SBE activities, we have a budget of $272 million. We have about 4,284 proposals each year, make awards of 1,042, a success rate or a funding rate of about 24%. Our average annualized awards are not what we would like them to be. We'd like them to be much higher, 137,000. We hold about 57 panels, and we support about 5,114 people, including 1,858 graduate students and 733 undergraduates. So about 70% of our funding in SBE goes to funding our core programs. So when I showed our major programs and divisions within SBE, 70% of our funding goes to our core programs. About 30% of our funding goes to our cross-directorate initiatives. And for me, one of the most exciting things in the year and a half since I've been at the National Science Foundation has been some of these cross-directorate initiatives. Coming from Northwestern, which is not quite as interdisciplinary as Carnegie Mellon, but it's a very interdisciplinary place. So I was used to interdisciplinary research, but at the National Science Foundation, we work across the directorates to fund some really important cross-directorate initiatives. And SBE, I'm happy to tell you, is central to all of these because, as the title here says, SBE investigates the human dimension of these crucial societal concerns, whether it's understanding the brain or risk and resilience, or innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water systems, or inclusion, includes as we call it. It's SBE as the directorate that really focuses on people and human organizations that are at the center. So I just want to go through some of these cross-directorate initiatives to give you a sense of what we're doing. When you see the dollar signs there, this is the amount that we are investing in each of these initiatives for fiscal year 2017, which begins October the 1st. But we're already investing in most of these. And what's interesting is Understanding the Brain is a cross-directorate initiative of every one of the directorates except for geosciences. And so SBE is working closely with biological sciences, engineering, computer sciences, mathematical and physical sciences. We are all working together, and the goal is to understand the full complexity of the brain in action and in context. And the question that we are really focusing on in the SBE sciences is to look at the dynamic relationship between brain structure and activity and human cognition and behavior. Another cross-directorate initiative that I'm really excited about and that several of us have talked about today is risk and resilience, critical, resilient, interdependent infrastructure and systems. We have these very long acronyms at NSF to get a lot in. So CRISP. And the reason we're thinking that CRISP is so important is because Our economic competitiveness and the societal well-being in the United States really does depend on the dependability, availability, quality, and the reliability of our infrastructure systems. But there are two big risks to those infrastructure systems. One risk is the risk from natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. The other risk is from people, mistakes people make, or terrorist activities. And so we are contributing to this initiative to answer questions from the social, behavioral, and economic sciences on how social and behavioral factors contribute to critical interdependent infrastructure risk. So what we can do so that those risks don't happen, and once the risks have taken place, how can we better inform people? How can we better take care of people once things have occurred? A third cross-directorate initiative is the innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water systems, INFUSE as we call it. The goal here is to enhance our capacity to explore the interactions among food, energy, and water systems, and to understand how these systems interact with the social, political, and economic systems. So this is a third cross-directorate initiative that SBE is really at the center of. A fourth initiative is one that we are just getting underway this year, and it has the longest acronym of all: Inclusion Across the Nation of Communities of Learners of Underrepresented Discoverers in Engineering and Science. And so you can be very glad that we are just, in short, calling it INCLUDES, which I think gets across the meaning of it. What we're doing here is we're investing in new research models and partnerships that can lead to demonstrable progress in meeting the challenge of broadening participation. And why is this such a high priority for NSF? It is because women and minorities remain underrepresented in STEM fields and in the educational pipeline. And so in order, we think, to meet the challenges of the future, we want to open the door to more people. And we think that all of science and engineering is going to be benefiting from this. The contribution that the SBE science is making here is to the science of broadening participation. And we are going to be sending a Dear Colleague letter. In fact, maybe that Dear Colleague letter is already out. And we want to understand the positive and the negative factors that are impacting the participation of women and underrepresented minorities. And we're funding research. We have funded and will continue to fund research on these factors, things like implicit bias, explicit bias, and stereotype threat. So I'm not going to go into as much detail at all about the other continuing investments in cross-directorate activities, secure and trustworthy cyberspace, or SATSI. I'm sure that when Jim Carosa was here to speak that he talked in depth about that. One of the things that I really like about Jim's discussion of that is he always says that secure and trustworthy cyberspace is not a technological problem and cannot be solved through technology alone. It's a socio-technological problem, and we're going to solve this in combination with social, behavioral, and economic sciences. We're also focusing on the cyber infrastructure framework for the 21st century science and engineering and education. And when I was talking to faculty today, I have to say I heard a lot about the importance of data infrastructure and data science. And so what we have got to be absolutely sure in funding our cyber infrastructure framework for the 21st century, that we have got to be sure that we are answering the kind of questions that came up today. And so this is one of the things that I found really helpful in my conversations today about the importance of big data, research infrastructure, and how we need to do really more in this area. So the opportunities that I've just been talking about, those are the opportunities of the core research that we fund. The opportunities both in our core programs and the research opportunities in our cross-directorate initiatives. But we face some really big challenges in the social, behavioral, and economic sciences. And I want this next part of my talk to focus on what those challenges are. The first challenge is the challenge of how we can better communicate the value of the SBE sciences. As some of you perhaps recall, the former Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma used to put out an annual waste book of federal spending projects that he thought were really wasteful. Well, since he retired in 2015, several other congressmen have taken up his mantle, and we have the waste report from Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. We have the waste of the week from Senator Dan Coates, Republican from Indiana. We have America's Most Wasted from Senator John McCain of Arizona. Jurassic Park from Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona. So we are hearing in all of these reports about the wasteful spending of the federal government. Well, there have been 3 actual waste books released in the past 8 months. Flake's, Oklahoma Senator Langford's, and Arizona Senator John McCain's. And together, they feature 251 government programs or other funding programs. Of these 251 programs, 26 of them are from the National Science Foundation. And 8 of those were SBE projects. So you might have thought, and we might have thought when we first did the analysis to see how many were SBE, that there were a lot more, because it sometimes seems to us from our seat at SBE that we are always under attack from Congress. But I don't want to take this lightly. We needed to respond to those, but it's not as many as we thought. Nonetheless, we do continue to be singled out, and I want to share with you some of the things that we are doing. One of the things that we do is when one of our projects gets singled out in a report, we look carefully at the project, what it was about, why it might have been singled out, and we write a simple response about its intellectual merit and its broader impact. And I'm delighted to say that the director of NSF, France Cordova, often goes to see the member of Congress and explains the research. So just for example, John McCain's research waste book had an example from a researcher named Jody Plermont, who had developed a virtual environment for her colleagues to study how children cross the street. And this was this virtual environment, and they were studying how children cross the street to understand the way children thought about crossing the street, the way drivers thought about seeing or not seeing children. And this research was determined to be so important that Toyota has taken the research up and is using it in much of its own research about cars in the future. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is, however, we don't want to just be responsive when there's a negative thing. We also want to be responsive positively, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. The second thing that is a challenge that I'm going to talk about is the challenge of robust and reliable science. So why is it so hard to communicate the value of the SBE sciences? Why is it so challenging? Part is we have numerous audiences. We have scientists inside NSF, outside NSF, all of you. We have Congress and other policymakers. We have the public. We have journalists. And so there are these multiple audiences that we have to respond to, and we have to think about how to communicate our story about science, the science of science communication to these people. Also, basic research in the SBE sciences is sometimes difficult to explain. Studies sometimes appear kind of obvious or may be easily trivialized or mocked. Why should we study nonverbal communication? Why should we study auctions? The methodology is sometimes misunderstood, and as I showed in the 3 examples before, sometimes there's a really long time lag between the basic science findings and application. We don't see this so much in computer science or engineering, but we do see this longer time lag in the social sciences sometimes. So what have we done across NSF? Well, first of all, we have established what we're calling the transparency and accountability of our award abstracts and titles. As scientists, you submit to us cutting-edge research, and your abstract shows that cutting-edge research, and you have some terrific title. But sometimes that's not so clear to the lay public when they look at that title and they look at that abstract, especially to members of the science committee in the House of Representatives when they have their staff go through all of the titles and abstracts of our funding to pick out what might be problematic to them. And so what we are doing now under the title of Transparency and Accountability, we are working with the PI, you might have had this experience, some of you, to rewrite the title and the abstract so that it is very, very clear and that it can be read and understood by the lay public. And we also have an Office of Legislative and Public Affairs who is making arrangements for us to get out more and more briefings on our research and what the research is about. And so we are sending out fact sheets and press releases about the research we fund. And finally, congressional briefings. We're having congressional briefings, and we are also going to Congress and meeting with members of Congress to talk about the research that we're funding. So just in the last couple of weeks, I've been to the Appropriations Committee, the Science Committee, and I have been to see several members of Congress to just sit down and talk to them about what their agendas are and to talk about what we're doing. And I always begin these by saying, you have many people who come to you as people who have a big ask. I'm not coming with a big ask. I'm really coming to tell you about the great science that we support and so that you can see us at SBE, at the National Science Foundation, as a resource. When you're developing a talk for your constituents, if you want to talk about a particular issue, if you want to call us up and say, well, what's the research that's been funded, we would be happy to help. And they actually seem to be doing that and like that. In the SBE directorate, we have hired a dedicated communication specialist. We have a strategy. We're ramping up our social media presence. You can go on Twitter and find little tweets about some of our research findings from researchers like you. And we are training our program staff on their communications responsibilities. So that's what we're doing in the area of communications. Is it working? We will see. I hope it's working. I think that the congressional briefings and our going and meeting with members of Congress is making a real difference. The Congressman Smith, who's head of the Science Committee, really likes how we are making our abstracts and titles clearer so he can read them and see why it's important. So what's our other big challenge? The other big challenge is the challenge of what we're calling robust and reliable science. You have seen a lot on the front pages of the New York Times and on the cover of the Atlantic and other popular magazines that science is often not being reproduced and replicated, and this is a problem. So we task our advisory committee with trying to look at robust and reliable science. Our advisory committee had a big 2 or 3 day workshop on this and ended up writing a report. You can see the title here, SBE Science's Perspectives on Robust and Reliable Science. And what they did as a contribution is that they defined what robust and reliable science is. Their definition of robust and reliable science is science that is reproducible, replicable, and generalizable. And they defined each of those terms. Reproducible, another researcher can take exactly the same data using the same methods and reproduce the findings. Replicability is a researcher taking a different data set and replicating those findings with a different data set. And generalizability is the extent to which we can generalize from findings to other populations and groups. And at the end of their report, they suggested that we could do research in SBE on robust and reliable science. They were clear to say, we're not saying that SBE should be taking this on because the problem is an SBE problem. This is a problem that has been said to be a problem across the sciences and across all of the directorates to some extent. So they said we need research to figure out what actually is the extent of the problem. To what extent are there differences across the fields? What are best practices? And then, to the extent there's a problem, what are the causes of the problem? And which of those are most important? We should look at, they told us, questionable research practices, the kind of incentives that there are in universities to publish quickly and to publish new findings and new data and using new data rather than first to think about replicating and reproducing prior findings. And so They want us to understand not just research practices, but if there are incentives in the academic culture, in journal policies, funding agency policies. We often hear, oh, you know, that didn't get funded because they're really just wanting to replicate something that we already know. Well, the fact is, sometimes we don't know, and research needs to be replicated. And then finally, the question is, to the extent there's a problem, what can we do to fix the problem? And so these are some of the things that we are thinking about asking for research on. We want to strengthen sound science across the science enterprise. We want to support workshops on robust and reliable research. We want to support research to replicate and generalize pivotal disciplinary findings, and we want to support research to improve robust and reliable science. So these are some of the ways that we want to tackle this issue, and I would just welcome also your ideas about this. So, in conclusion, at the beginning I showed you a kind of heuristic model that showed that we are trying in the SBE sciences to understand human behavior and social organizations. I have tried to give you a sense of how we are looking forward to continuing SBE's investments in basic research and training to create the knowledge that we think is going to improve our future. I've tried to show you just a few examples of how SBE research that we funded has had important impacts. We in the Social Behavior and Economic Sciences Directorate have funded the research of 52 Nobel Prize winners in economics, including at least one winner every year since 1997. Since 2006, we funded the research of 20 MacArthur Fellows, or MacArthur Geniuses, as they're sometimes called. And note that we funded their research after they won those prizes, not when we knew that they were prize winners. We funded the research that allowed them to do the great research for this prize they won. So moving forward, we think this is a really exciting time for the SBE Sciences and for the SBE Directorate. We are by far the smallest of NSF's 7 directorates. A third the size of some, a fourth the size of budget of others. But actually, I think we're central because we're the directorate that focuses on people, and we have research on people as our major focus. Also, we participate in many of those cross-directorate initiatives because societal concerns like risk and resilience and understanding the brain and cybersecurity really cannot be understood just as technological or biological or environmental problems without thinking about people at the center of it all, as this slide shows. So we do think that it really does take understanding people to unlock most of the societal conundrums that we have, and we will continue to do that as long as we continue to have the great scientists here at Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere who are sending us your outstanding proposals, and we appreciate everything you do. You are a really important part of our SBE and NSF community. So I'm happy to take some questions.
I would like to comment the effect of geosciences on SBE. Thank you. I would like to comment on the effect of geosciences on SBE, such as tsunami, geothermal energy, and tidals, El Nino. They all cause changes in the climate change, and that can have an effect on SBE. Do you have any comments on that?
Absolutely, I agree. And we work with the Geosciences Directorate it's really the Geosciences Directorate, the Engineering Directorate, and the SBE Directorate that are working together on innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water, and we're working on risk and resilience. So when I talked about the Cross-directorate initiative on risk and resilience, one of the big risks is risk from natural disasters as well as risk from people. And the risk from natural disasters that GEO has asked us to work with them on is how do we communicate to people that there is going to be a tornado or a flood or a tsunami coming? How do we communicate that risk in advance so that people will listen to it? But once the horrible natural disaster has occurred, it's how do we make a difference in helping people in that situation? Because often, as you well know, there is just chaos, and so people have to be helped. And so that's another way that we are working with the geosciences. But we really do consider ourselves partners in those two, in several initiatives, but with the geosciences especially, innovations at the nexus of food, energy, and water, and risk and resilience.
And I might just add that over the last couple of decades, this directorate has supported several tens of millions of dollars of work here at Carnegie Mellon on decision-making related to climate and energy issues.
Right, absolutely. Sorry.
I'm going to bring a microphone to you one second.
Okay. And may be able to talk without that.
We're recording it for that.
Okay. So, Fay, when you presented the organization chart on the
Yes.
right side, you had a interdisciplinary social and behavioral research. Is that a
Yes.
separate program, or is that something you encourage in all your programs?
We have three divisions, and then there is what we call, and you're right, I didn't talk about it, SMA, the SBE multidisciplinary activities. And that is where we have, we do a lot of interdisciplinary work, but that is where some of that interdisciplinary work is really located. So, for example, that's where our Science of Learning Centers began as a cross-SBE activity. That's where we have our postdoctoral program. That's where we have the Science of Science Innovation Policy program. That's where we have our undergraduate research experiences for undergraduates. We fund about 750 undergraduates. So I really should have mentioned that.
Thank you.
Fay, thanks again for visiting us and spending the day with us. Really greatly appreciate that. You alluded to this in the course of your presentation and during the day as well. This idea of where data sciences and social science intersect, and the extent to which you see the need for new studies in social science on account of the fact that you have all these new kinds of data sources being made available. Do you see that as something that is part of SBE's sort of focus, or do you see this as part of one of the cross-directorate efforts that you outlined? Because I could see elements of it in both these, both aspects of your presentation.
Right.
I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, we have to think about this as both within SBE and across SBE. across all the directorates. So the cross-directorate initiative that we have, that I listed under the 4 that I didn't go into, or 3 that I didn't go into, there was one called CIF 21, Cyber Infrastructure for the 21st Century. Now, it's there that we fund projects on big data, and we are joint with computer information science in looking at big data and several of the other directorates, because big data, we think, needs both SBE and computer science and engineering and education and human resources. But we also have within SBE a real interest in this. And within SBE, we have a program called RIDER, RIDIR. And RIDER is Research Investments for Data-Intensive Research. You know, these acronyms, but it's RIDER, look it up, and RIDER is providing grants. We've got 3 grant proposals that we've currently funded, and they are much larger than the traditional ones, and we are saying to our scientists, SBE needs a better data infrastructure. Come to us with your ideas for data infrastructure, pulling together big data sets that can answer important research questions. So RIDER is just within SBE at this point in time. But one of the things I talk to people about today is our grand challenges for the future. And I really do believe that data, big data, understanding how to think about data, understanding what are the important questions that we should be asking with all this huge amounts of data that scientists are getting, can be used. And you made such an important point to me. You made the point that SBE's biggest contribution here could be looking at the causal analysis. So often with this huge revolution in big data, people are correlating big data, and they're just using it. I hate to say, some scientists, none of you here, are kind of using it mindlessly, doing correlations. The big questions need to be there, and you made the point, which I totally agreed with you, is that the SBE contributions should be in causal analysis, understanding big data, but how we can use causal analysis and develop better methods to understand relationships within that data. And you're going to send me some questions about that and more information. Great.
So let me echo Krishnan's appreciation for coming. It's great to have you. And that was a very informative talk. So at the very beginning of the talk, you had mentioned a few of the surveys and
Yes.
instruments that you've maintained for a long time, and you also hinted at maybe new ones you were thinking of developing. I mean, I in my perspective, there's been a huge gain every time NSF or some other comparable agency has created, right, an instrument that's big enough to create data, right, either in social or natural science that scientists can work on for a long time. So can you give us some hints about where you were thinking of doing that toward the future?
I can't. Because this is something that it's a great question. The big 3 are very expensive. The other ones that I laid out, the time-shared experiments, tests, the Luxembourg Income Dynamic Study Center, all of these are really expensive. And what we have to be thinking about is what's the best investment in our money going forward. And this is, I think, one of our challenges. And I welcome your ideas about Dean Krishnan is got some ideas he's going to be giving me, and I'm going to take those very seriously. If you have some ideas about what you think we should do, this is a time when we really are thinking about the challenges for the future, because we have a little time now, because we don't have to develop that fiscal year 2018 budget. And I have asked every group I've spoken with today, what are the grand challenges in the SBE sciences? So if you wrote up for me a couple of your thoughts about what we should be doing there and what we shouldn't be doing, it would mean a lot, and we'd take it very seriously.
Hey, one last and very quick question from you. Yeah.
So you talked about two challenges, and they kind of play off each other a little bit, and I was wondering if you could talk about that. So for example, the incentives for producing novel insights, new contributions, things that a legislator isn't going to pick on for just replicating something that has been done already, and how do you communicate that value of the replications and the things that might not seem as novel?
Well, I think we are communicating it by simply having an interest in robust and reliable science. This whole theme is so important that Director of NSF France Cordova held an NSF-wide symposium, town hall meeting for the whole day for all of our program officers. And Marcia McNutt, editor of Science, came and spoke because Marcia McNutt really cares about data sharing. She really cares about robust and reliable science. She really cares about ethical research. And so she spoke and really challenged us across the foundation. And so SBE has taken up that gauntlet and said, it's not an SBE problem per se, but we in SBE can help address the issue. And if you look around some of the SBE disciplines, there has become a real renewed interest in the importance of replication and the importance of reproducibility. And we are figuring out ways that we can legitimize the importance of reproducing and replicating research before you go on to that next big question.
Thank you so much, Fay. Help me thank Fay for a fabulous presentation. So